Hi everybody, and welcome to my video. I'm Susan, and thanks for watching. In honor of Halloween, today I'm going to be doing a sketchbook drawing from my recent visit to Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris. And here's a video I took while I was there. You can see that most of the burials there are above ground, like you find in New Orleans, and they're in these beautiful mausoleums. And the mausoleums are done in different architectural styles. There's an Egyptian one right there next to a Gothic one. They're Romanesque and modern. So it's full of just really interesting sketching ideas. And then here's the mausoleum I'll be drawing. It's in the Gothic style with a lot of interesting pointed arches and things. And so that's the photo I chose to work from because it has just such cool detail. Now, I would call the type of drawing I'm doing here urban sketching. And urban sketching is so popular now, but you really need to do that on location in the moment. And since I'm working from photos, I'm calling this armchair urban sketching. So even if it's not true urban sketching, it's a great way to improve your drawing and painting skills. And I would just encourage anyone who's watching this to go break out your vacation photos and find some cool things to start drawing and sketching. It's just a great way to relive those moments when you were on vacation and relaxing and having a great time. So my artwork here is going to be done in 3 parts. There's going to be the pencil sketch, there's the inking, and then the painting. And right now I'm obviously doing the pencil sketch. I'm using my new disco ball pencil that I got on my trip. I hope that the little disco ball on the end isn't too distracting to watch. But at this point, while I'm doing the pencil sketch, I'm mostly concerned with getting the proportions of the drawing correct. I'm starting with the largest shapes, and I make sure they're all the correct dimensions, and then I move down to the smaller details, and I'll end with the background. But if the larger shapes aren't put in correctly, then everything else is going to fall apart as I go smaller and smaller. You just have to be very observant and make sure the elements are lining up the way they are in the photo. And the pencil sketch phase is the time when you can make all of your mistakes because they're correctable at this point. And you'll see that I'm doing a lot of correcting in this drawing. I don't think there was a single feature that I didn't have to erase and redraw at some point. But you've got to remember in doing that, you're improving your drawing skills, I'm improving my observation skills, and learning from my mistakes. And as I'm drawing each element in the mausoleum, I'm looking at it in relation to the other parts of the drawing and checking that in comparison with the photo. For example, the little capitals on the side columns, I noticed that they are just a little higher than the top of the molding around the door, and I want to make sure they're in the right position. And I'm also checking the negative space, which is the space between the elements in the drawing. So I'm looking to see, is the space in between the columns and the door correct? And is the little round window above the door in the right position relative to the molding that's under the roof and the top of the door? It sounds like a lot to be checking, but your pencil drawing is the best place to do that. And observing how things line up relative to each other is one of the best ways to improve your drawing skill. If something looks off in your drawing, it's probably because you have it out of position relative to the other things that are in the drawing. I also did a little research on Père Lachaise that I thought would be fun to share with you while you're watching the drawing. It's just a fascinating place. If you ever have a chance to go, I would highly recommend it. It was founded as a cemetery in 1804 by Napoleon, and at that time it was on the outskirts of Paris, and it really wasn't a popular burial site for several reasons, but eventually they relocated the bodies of a few famous people there, particularly Molière, who's a French playwright. And once some famous people were buried there, then other people were like, oh, well, I want to be buried with them. So it became a lot more popular as a final resting place. And this mausoleum had the names of the Georget and Lacombe families on the front. And I was just really curious to know more about them, but couldn't find out any information on them. It was just some thoughts. It was really so interesting for me to wander through there, and I could see some of the famous graves, like we saw where Oscar Wilde was buried, and we saw where Chopin and Jim Morrison were buried, and Edith Piaf and Gertrude Stein and Olivia Wilde, not Olivia Wilde, well, she's not dead yet, Olivia de Havilland were buried. And then there are the tombs of a lot of other famous but lesser known people, and they would have their accomplishments all carved on their graves. And I don't know, just seeing that many tombs just sort of made you think, yeah, they were really famous when they were alive, and now they're just another tomb here in Pere Lachaise that people walk by and admire. I don't know, deep thoughts for the drawing today. So now you can see I've moved on to the inking part of my drawing. I use Unipens as the brand of ink pen that I use. They're fine liners, and they're in several different widths. I use the thicker width, which would be a 0.3, for usually the exterior lines, the outside lines of the main items in my drawing, and they go down to thinner widths. The finest I use is a 0.05. I might use that for the detail inside the molding or smaller elements or things that I really don't want to be the focus. I also have one that's a lighter gray that I use in certain areas that I really don't want to emphasize, but they need to have, they need just to be outlined and delineated. So here's some other interesting information I learned while I was doing a little research for this video. So I keep referring to this little structure as a mausoleum, and a mausoleum is a place that could have several tombs. That's like burial spots. An individual burial spot is the tomb for a family. So you could bury multiple family members in a mausoleum. And a crypt, though, is different. A crypt is a below ground vault that could have burial spaces in it. And I don't know if these mausoleums are handled in the same way as they are in New Orleans, but I know that in New Orleans, because my husband's from there and we've had family members buried there and things, when we had a family member being buried in the mausoleum, my husband had to sign a paper giving permission for them to rearrange the interior of the mausoleum. And basically what they do to make room for new coffins is they will combine the bones down in a crypt area below the mausoleum. So they might take the coffin, they will respectfully remove the contents, which are desiccated by that time because it's so hot in New Orleans, and they'll push all those remains to the back of the mausoleum, and there's a little chute back there, and those remains will fall down into a crypt where all your family members' remains will end up eventually. And then that leaves more room for new burials. So I'm very curious to know if these tombs are done the same way. I also wanted to know why they're above ground here. I know in New Orleans a lot of it has to do with the water table, and I found out that one of the reasons people are buried above ground like this a lot of the time in France is because France was a Roman colony many moons ago for quite a while when it was Gaul, and the Romans buried their dead in mausoleums like this. And so the French sort of followed that Roman tradition and have buried their deceased family members in these mausoleums just traditionally since then. Not that people aren't buried in the ground as well. That also happens, but that's where the tradition of the mausoleum came from. And if you think about it also, it's a real space saver, because you can bury a whole family in really a relatively small area, and you don't have to take up a lot of land for individual grave sites. Okay, so back to the art part of the video. I used a very limited palette to paint the stonework in this portion of the painting. I blended in Naples yellow, which is a pale, very opaque watercolor, yellow ochre, sienna, and ultramarine blue, wet into wet, with the colors fairly separated to get the variation that I wanted to show in the stonework. Then after that had dried, I came in, like I'm coming in here, and I layered in more of the darks and added the shadows, just using a mixture of the same colors with a little more blue and sienna, and I added less water so the colors were stronger. Now, this sketchbook doesn't have watercolor paper in it, so I really can't layer too much, and I have to be very careful to be sure that each area is dry before I add more paint, because if I get the paper too wet, it doesn't take the paint too well, and I end up getting dark spots. And also, since it's not watercolor paper, the page tends to get pretty wrinkly and warped as I work on it. And so to correct that, after the painting is dried, I actually go and I iron the paper with a warm iron. Not hot, because it's not like I'm ironing a shirt or something, but a warm iron is great because it'll smooth out a lot of that warping and wrinkling that I have, and it'll help the page to lie flat. So if you have a sketchbook that isn't watercolor paper, that's just a great way to make your drawings and your paintings look a little better in it by smoothing them out a little bit. So here I'm going in and painting the background, those mausoleums that are in the back, and to make them separate from the mausoleum in the front, I mean, they're all pretty much the same color, I really made them dark, really emphasized the shadows, because that will make the lighter mausoleum in the front stand out more. Providing enough contrast between your darks and your lights is really important in watercolor, because if you don't have enough contrast, your watercolors will tend to look flat. So if you're looking for a way to easily improve your watercolor technique, you're wondering sort of what is wrong with my watercolors, I would suggest trying to go darker with your darks. A lot of people are afraid to go really dark in their paintings. I don't know, it's just making such a commitment sometimes to really go dark. I would absolutely suggest doing it. Don't be afraid to go really dark where you need to in your paintings. While I'm thinking about it, I want to give a shout out to 2 other YouTube channels that gave me a lot of my information for this video. One was called Autumn Shea Films. I'll link down in the description. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And then the other one was Ask a Mortician. Isn't that cool? There are YouTube videos for everything out there, but they were both very interesting. I'll put links down in the descriptions in case you want to learn more about mausoleums, and they had mostly things about burials in New Orleans, but they were fascinating if you're interested in learning in learning more about that. Now I'm painting this little round window. It was stained glass. It's in the top of this mausoleum. A lot of the mausoleums have beautiful stained glass like this that you can see if you look through the doors. It's in the back. And that was because family members could unlock the doors. You could go in and have some private prayer time with your deceased relatives in there. And if you also look back at that picture, you could see some of the tombs on the sides, either side of the stained glass window. Now, a lot of the tombs were in not great repair, and I learned that currently, if you want to be buried in Pere Lachaise, you lease your gravesite. You can lease it for 5 years, 10 years, or 30 years, that being the most expensive. And at the end of your lease, if your family doesn't re-up it, they dig you up and they cremate your remains and put them in the ossuary. And an ossuary is a repository for bones. And it's beautiful. It's a large building. Apparently that's almost full as well. But it's different from here in the U.S. where you're buried and it's in perpetuity. They can't dig you up and do anything with you. Here, yeah, if you don't keep up your rent, you get kicked out of your gravesite and then put into the ossuary. I think that's really, really interesting. But I don't think they do that, of course, with any of these mausoleums. I don't think this was the case when they first started Pere Lachaise. Someone could know more than me, that might be wrong, but they're not removing people from these mausoleums and then putting them in the ossuary. I'm pretty sure they're set. So now the final touches on my painting, I wanted to add the sky. It was a beautiful day while we were there. The leaves were changing. It's becoming fall, and yeah, I just wanted to give this final touch to show a little bit of the nature that surrounds all the tombs in Pere Lachaise. So I'm finishing up right now, and this will be the end of our little painting and learning expedition at Pere Lachaise Cemetery. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you'll consider subscribing to my channel. Thanks so much for watching, and again, I hope you have a chance to visit Pere Lachaise sometime in the future. Thanks so much for watching, and take care. Bye-bye.